Thanks, Lars. Yeah, so I'm Aaron Long, and just finished my doctorate at the University of Kansas. Before that, I was at American University in Washington, D.C. I hold degrees in philosophy, literature, and English, so mostly a humanities, kind of jack of all trades. Got my start in communication, so I'm something of a systems thinker. And somewhere along the way, blundered into teaching at the Kansas City Art Institute. Found myself working with creative thinkers, and it's been just a fantastic arc of beginning academic career. But what I really like about working with artists is that's where humanities thinking and theoretical thinking really starts to materialize and starts to turn into things that show up at street level. And so these ideas, at least as I like to deal with them, don't really belong hold up in a university circle. They need to sort of blast out of that circle and out into the world where they can do some good. And so it's a real treat to be here today and talk with you all, especially since I tend to think of careers in like kind of biotic terms, and so I work with sort of little sprouts just getting planted in their careers, and you all are in full flower. As a designer myself, my work, it tends to be instructional design, and I don't necessarily mean quite the same thing that many of your employers might with that. It's not just online work for me. It's about the space of the classroom and what it can do. It's about of course, academic documents, and some of those are a bit stuffy and stodgy and a little inaccessible to students. So I've worked over the last few years to try to make those things work a bit more user-friendly ways. And then my research is technically on a bit of industrial design history from about 1860 to 1920 is where it really intensely focused, and it's an investigation how literature inspired the modern vehicles that particularly disrupted the world in terms of the Great War and transportation culture at the beginning of the 20th century. So deal with a lot with biomorphism and biomimicry and sort of where those visions originated. So that's some of where this comes from for me. I won't get into a ton of that today, but you'll see just one brief case study, and I happen to be one scholar who's fortunate enough to have the moment that my research sort of had an aha moment, like caught on video, and we'll get to see that today. So I'm really excited to show that to you. But before we do that, I wonder if we could start with a question and maybe hear from about 3 people. And when if you'd like to sound off on this, if you could also tell us your name, what kind of design you do, and where you do it. The question is there fiction that has influenced the work you do as a designer?
That's a deep question.
If people are uncomfortable speaking, they could put it in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lars.
So by asking that, you mean like a fictional book that we've read that has informed, like,
I'm glad you
the
asked.
design that we made?
I
Yeah.
have intentionally not defined fiction. As we will see, there's a lot to that.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Hi, good morning. My name is Lauren Robinson, and I work at NetSmart, and I am pretty much doing healthcare design with all its complexity. And I guess when I think of this question, I would say that I don't know if this is quite the answer that you're looking for, but when I'm really thinking about putting myself in the shoes of the people I'm designing for, I kind of try to build a story, like where are they going to start? How are they going to get through this screen? What is their actual workflow? So it's kind of building a story along the way. So, because with healthcare, I'm sure, like most people know, it is very difficult. And without a fiction or a story, it can get really, really confusing and really, really big really quick. So that's just kind of, I guess, my thoughts on the question.
That's awesome. Anybody else want in there? Okay. Well, then to Tom's point, it sounds like what we might need to do is define fiction. So that's fortuitously one of the things that I hope we can get done today. And then another thing we might need to do to really get into this is recognize the importance of critical engagement with fiction. So to the extent that fiction's out there influencing us, and I hope to show that it's actually maybe influencing us in more ways than we might normally consider. And then a third thing, I'd love to start a conversation on how ethical thinking in our respective design fields, how that works, and how we might, enrich that thinking for the future. And I think the more we enrich our ethical thinking about design, the more that enriches our thinking about literature, and the more that allows us to be intentional about how fiction influences our design, especially when and where it is. So, coming from a university setting, there's always a thesis, right? And so I thought I'd offer you just a few of these today. And so one is making fiction is a type of design work. And maybe that's not a way we're used to thinking about it. So if you're skeptical about that, give me a minute, because maybe I can change your mind. So Anne-Marie Willis just published a fascinating book. It's called The Design Philosophy Reader. It's an anthology of sort of more theoretical texts on design. It comes from Bloomsbury Press. I just got my hands on a copy. It came out late last year, and I've been working my way through that. And she has several kind of essays that bind together a lot of other people's work in this anthology. And so you'll see me referring to various pieces of her work from there, and I think she's done a great job to sort of sum up, which is what makes her ideal for a presentation like this. And what I think is really profound about this quote is she points out that if fiction is designed, right, or if anything is designed, but here we're talking about fiction, then it's designed locally, right? So it comes from a specific time and place. And then if it's designed locally, the implications of when, where, how, and by whom it's designed should be made apparent to us, particularly if fiction is influencing the design work we do. And so she would say that, that's an important part of just understanding our own designs and where they come from as well. And this is why Tom's question, well, what do we mean by fiction, really does matter. And I think you say fiction, and a lot of people think of something that looks like the icon on the left, right? It's a book. It's what's behind you on the shelf, and Ray Bradbury or something like that. And yet there are all kinds of other forms of fiction that kind of permeate our lives. For many of us, it's television or film, and I want to leave the door open for gaming to be part of fiction as well. If I put it that way, does that nuance the question? Is there fiction that influences the design work you do? Does that change anybody's answer or perspective on that?
I know for myself, at least, looking like at video game menu screens and even just the way games are designed, you know, the way as we play the video games and we work through the scenarios or the different tasks and things like that, it definitely resonates. Maybe I'm more influenced by game designers as well, in my own work.
Well, and that certainly makes sense for any designer working in UX or UI. a game is sort of fundamentally a UI. Yeah. So, as we think about fiction across these sort of media, there are a couple words that might just sort of help to nuance a bit. You'll hear me use the word text, and I have a big tent view of text. So to some people you say text and they think of something that's printed or written, or maybe the little things on our phones that we send to one another. But I tend to see a text as a vehicle of maybe even an unexpected sort that's been designed by some kind of creator to get meaning from their mind to someone else's. And so I would tell my art students, a sculpture is a text in a way, right? A painting is a text in a way. So that's one to have on the table. And then, do we have something in the chat window?
That's me. We're getting gray boxes on the screen. Maybe hide your video. Or maybe that's just me that sees the gray boxes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I saw Count of Monte Cristo comment in the chat as an influence on someone's design work. So just giving voice to that. It's like,
yeah, we're getting gray boxes. Other people are getting gray boxes as well. I don't know what that is.
Okay. So another term we probably should think about is medium, right? In the environment through which a text travels. And I think that's where, as we start thinking about fiction, medium actually really matters quite a bit. And when we say fiction is designed, it might make more sense to think about it as a vehicle for meaning traveling through a medium. When we put it that way, then maybe it's not such a stretch to think of fiction as a designed entity. I was thinking about the ways different, media of fiction or different types of text are designed, and of course, designed for specific purposes. To recall, to inform, persuade, entertain. Usually, some mixture of those. The ways they evoke attention or invite engagement. And of course, that's varied over the life of fiction, from print media up to gaming. I feel like gaming requires an intensive amount of attention, even compared to reading. But it's such fast stimulus that I don't ever feel like I've done a good job when I'm attending to gaming compared to reading, which I can slow way down. Portability struck me as something that's fairly important when we're thinking about fiction and the way it can literally travel with you. And the way certain media like television was literally once very not portable. Growing up, my folks had one of those TVs kind of built into a piece of furniture, and we moved it once. And with today's TVs, I can't imagine we ever did it that way, but that's the way they were built. Now things are so much more portable. And then thinking also about the number of people it takes to create a text in each of these media. One author can write a book. Of course, multiple authors could, but until recently, cameras were big and unwieldy, and it really was probably a two-person job to film or record some kind of filmic fiction. And games have never been easily done by a single person, at least not since the 16-bit era. So whole teams of art and developers and everything else. So it's just interesting to think about fiction across these media as a designed entity. And so I started to think about the ways we might think of fiction writ large and the way these media interact within a fiction world. And I think one of the things the pandemic has probably made apparent to a lot of us is the volume at which certain media interact with our lives, right? And so this is maybe a snapshot of my last month, and from talking to just people in my life, I get a sense that this may be fairly average. The television and what's on it are probably one of the loudest, and maybe in your life games are louder than books or whatever, but that's sort of a way I was thinking about the media as a social as a constructed social reality. And that's really thinking based off of Bruno Latour's ideas and Pandora's Hope and We've Never Been Modern, Reassembling the Social. So if you're interested in this social view, Latour is your thinker there. Some people mute some forms of fiction. You know, I've people in my life that mute text, they just don't really read. So like text in the textual literary sense. I have people in my life that mute television, they just don't own one. And you know, lots of people that just games are on mute. That's not a way they get fiction. So as we think about the social, it might also help to think about not only what's loud, but what's quiet. And then the content of these media and what they're saying about one another is something I've been very aware of in an English department for the last 6 years. As I moved into research, you know, there's this television or you know, film kind of eye roll from some of my colleagues, and you know, usually, why would you waste your time on games? You know, just utter denigration of gaming from some people. And you know, that's coming from a place historically and you know, an awareness of what some of our work takes. But I do think it's a mistake to rule out screen-based fiction, even in a literature-oriented department. And then you know, the screen itself, right? Television and films often are riffing on books. So Veronica, you mentioned The Count of Monte Cristo. I think probably one of my biggest disappointments in college was seeing the film, the Jim Caviezel film version of that. You know, I loved the book growing up, and it's got 4 full, rich, scary villains, and the film gave us a whopping 2.5 villains, which was kind of a bummer. Okay, yes, I see you're with me there. And you know, and then there's this way that you know, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, for example, you know, I can't watch that now without realizing there's some whole gaming universe out there. You can go immerse yourself in a different way. And this is, from the game side, kind of the way things are marketed, right? It's like the movie, but you can play it. So it's interesting to think about the way these media converse with one another within the social order we build, or the society that they appear in. Another view we might take of fiction is the commercial view. And I don't necessarily know anyone who says, well, what's making the most money? I'm going to focus on that. But I think this is sort of an after reason. So I know people who don't read, but they watch, you know, a lot of TV and a lot of sports in particular. And sports is a kind of fiction. If you think, you know, think about the ways that's filmed and the way it's commentated, and even some of the graphic interface that's there to help package the consumption. And the rationale is, well, you know, that's where real successful people are. That's where cultural leadership is happening and that sort of thing. And so I started to look at, you know, where's the money go? And it just astounded me how much more is spent on film and television than either print media or gaming media. And we got something in the chat here. So, okay. And, you know, and watching, and then seeing those numbers sort of rise over the previous 5 years, you know, gaming is definitely on the rise financially. And, you know, and that's 8 billion in print media is still nothing to sneeze at, but compared to almost 300 in television and film, that's, oh, I picked the wrong field. So should have been in film and media studies. Another view we might take of fiction is what I sort of think of as a nutritional view. And so if you're in an English department, this is the prescribed diet. You know, read some text and then, you know, read some more, and read some print matter, read some more. Here's another kind you should read. It's print matter also. And maybe if you're in film and media studies, it looks a little bit more like this. And we don't really have gaming studies departments right now, but I'll get back to that in a minute. So I wonder what it would look like if we started to study gaming, you know, as a work of fiction, you know, not just as a craft, and I'd like to say comp sci, what that would look like, you know, sort of gaming criticism. I was guessing at the average American diet here. Yours may vary. And you may have a better read on that than I do. I'm coming out of a living in a world of books period of my life. So I'm not sure I have a great handle on what, if you're working in a 9 to 5, what media consumption must feel like. But then another way we could look at fiction that sort of makes sense of some of these other views is historically. And this is sort of my historical understanding of fiction, and that lightning bolt is actually more of a cataract. I don't have a great handle on fiction between about 1600 and 1750. 950 is Beowulf. 1066 is sort of the end of the Old English period, right? Beowulf kicks it off, and 1066 is when the French invaded England and English became Frenchified. And so this is where we start to see the King Arthur legend and Robin Hood, right? And those are legends that start to make their way into even our gaming world now. Anybody know what 1564 is?
Something to do with the Reformation?
That's a good guess. It's the year of our bard, right? That's when Shakespeare was born, and he's considered the first modern English author. So it's funny, my students will say, you know, I don't like Shakespeare, it's all written in Old English. I'm like, that ain't Old English. You wouldn't even be able to read it if it was Old English, right? So we laugh about that and read them some Old English. That isn't English. Oh, well, it was. The deep significance of the color here is, you know, gray is the sort of dark age of the medieval period, and, you know, and green is the flowering of literature in the modern. And so a lot of my work is right at the tail end of this timeline. What's interesting is when we set television against literature as a history, or screen-based fiction against, you know, literary fiction on this timeline. And here, you know, it's even still screen-based fiction is over 100 years old now. Right? Some of the first moving pictures were coming out in the 1890s. And, you know, the deep significance of the colors on that spectrum are, you know, we segued from black and white to the Triniton blue, green, and red. And we end with red because Netflix, right? So that. But it's a relatively short history. And so, you know, I mentioned film and media studies as kind of their own department. And, you know, the reason we don't have maybe game studies departments, and I might say yet, in universities is because look at how short the history is by comparison. And so the spectrum here is, you know, brown at the very beginning. That's the Odyssey, which is the first at-home gaming console, affectionately known as the brown box. And it didn't live long. It's marketed first in '72, and it didn't make it because television plugs were not necessarily as standardized, and of course nothing was nearly as portable. And I think, you know, if we think back to then, gaming was, you know, Pong was kind of the paradigm, and gaming was maybe not as exciting or immersive as it is now. And so then it's, you know, red for Mario, green for Luigi, or if you prefer Link, and blue for Sonic, right? Some of the great fictions of the gaming medium. And yellow because I think we are entering kind of a golden age of gaming, and, you know, the commercial view of fiction, I think, ratifies that view. So, you know, if we look at all of these different views of fiction, what it suggests to us is that fiction is deeply designed, right? The fact that we can kind of parse it out in these different ways and take these different views of it suggests that it's deployed with purposes that we become aware of depending on which of these views we take, right? To make money, to influence, you know, our environments in ways that maybe require a certain kind of media diet. It's definitely arising from certain times and places in history. And so the caveat is that fiction never speaks for itself, right? We always have to do interpretive work, and interpretive work can be kind of difficult. But it's really necessary if we want to get into what it is that fiction's doing when its designs work on us. So to kind of return to the, you know, the hypothesis that fiction is designed, you know, some of the ways we engage it as a design is when we determine it, what it's doing, right? Is this persuading for me? Is this entertaining? Is it just to inform? You know, the difference between the Oxford English Dictionary, which informs us of words' meanings, and the Urban Dictionary, which also entertains, is it's a marked difference, right? And that's not fiction, but there's this way that text of various sorts do these kinds of work and have a purpose that's sort of built in. It invites a certain kind of engagement, and we have to make decisions about how to engage fiction. And especially with gaming, because so much of gaming has been done with animation, one of the metrics we use is, well, that's very realistic. And so if we think about that for a minute, it invites us to bring a certain paradigm of what's real to the medium and to each text, and to ask, in what sense is this reflective of realism as I understand reality, that sort of thing. And so there's a deeply philosophical moment there, whether we engage it or not, and an opportunity to really reflect on what that means for our engagement with this or that game. And so I might even nuance the thesis that fiction is designed and say that fiction is a kind of design. So hopefully if you were skeptical of that at the outset, maybe I've convinced you just a little, or moved you just a little on that subject. To return to Willis, she points out that in this passage, and I'm not gonna, I don't want to read from the slide, but I figure we'll publish this later, and it might help you to have a larger passage for context to read at your leisure. But the takeaways here are that design moves us from desire for a particular result to a decision about how to make it happen. And I think we could argue that fiction definitely does that. And then she also points out that design is directed toward realization in some form or other. And that form, the form that realization takes, is different than the form of the design itself. And I think where fiction does cultural work, that's also absolutely true of it. And so there's this way that fiction sort of may escape us when we start talking about design writing, and yet there's this real way in which it very much is design writing. So I think from there we've accomplished what was, the first of our goals for the day. And so I want to bring us to a second point, which is that to the extent we allow uninterpreted fiction to cast vision for our work, we also allow it to influence our designs and maybe our process. And I think, part of the work we have to do as inhabitants of a world sort of fraught with fiction is, fraught's maybe a little bit of a hand-wringy term, but it's just everywhere, and some of it's great and some of it's a bit dark. And as designers, you can probably think of some of each of those, some really great texts that are inspiring and some really dark ones that you're like, okay, as a designer, I never want to make that world happen or whatever. And, we have to discern for each work of fiction the extent to which it's even relevant to our work, and then nuance that view into, to what extent is this work of fiction relevant to the purpose of my work? So if I'm working on, say, robotics, Black Mirror is certainly relevant to my work, but am I doing something that could go as egregiously wrong as maybe some of the robotic dystopias we see in Black Mirror? Or is that not even relevant? We have to make those kinds of decisions when we're consuming fiction. And here, I think Tony Fry, he's a designer in New Zealand, in a place called the Studio at the Edge of the World, and just a really smart bit from an essay that he published, or I'm sorry, from a book that he published in '99. And the takeaways here: the designed objects have consequences, right? Which is sort of intuitively obvious to us. And I love the way he says this: design futures or defutures, right? Which I take to mean it opens up some possibilities and forecloses some others. When we design something, we basically say, yes, we want these things to happen, and we're willing to give up on these other things happening. And then he also points out that the environment sort of that the designing happens in prefigures the act of design, and so also prefigures the product of our design work. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about, designing in a world where at the end of the day we go home and in one way or another engage in stories. And even if you're not a fiction consumer, a fiction, someone who's inspired and regularly involved in fiction, he points out that it's in our environment, and we even see this in tech, right? We see, like Palantir is one company in tech, and there are these sort of borrowing of tech company names from across fiction universes, and so it's an interesting phenomenon that the more we think about it, the more we see fiction's kind of fingerprints even on some of the companies in the sectors we work in as designers. What I don't think is necessarily straightforward is the relationship between fiction and our vision of the future. So fiction is, in all the forms we've been discussing it in the lower left here, and our vision for the future. I was looking for a crystal ball icon, but alas, there was not one. So I gave you a different shaped screen, which, is sort of our mirror on the future, darker or lighter, depending on how we are today. The fiction that in our world that we are exposed to doesn't automatically translate to that vision of the future. There's this represented as just sort of giant magnifying glass, but that's sort of our criticality, right? Our ability to engage that fiction and decide, yes, we want to opt for these possibilities, opt against these other possibilities. And I think that's a helpful way to think about it. And the more I've studied fiction professionally, the more I've become aware of my own sort of lens through which I view it. And that lens may change depending on what work of fiction or what medium of fiction I'm looking at. And so I want to invite us to sort of focus on that lens this morning. And this is where I think design ethics starts to come in. Because as we apply our design ethics to reading the fiction in our everyday lives, it builds that kind of like a muscle for our design work, and vice versa. That can be a very productive kind of cross-pollination, but it also may enrich sort of the future vision we have for the work we're doing, and enrich what we would want to see the world become, whether or not we have in our occupations the power to decide that in a grander scheme in our companies and our employers. We still do have the wherewithal to sign off on what we contribute to. And so that brings us to an interesting moment in my research history and a conversation that's really about that. So this is, in a sense, a time machine, and I'd love for you to jump aboard with me here. What we're about to see is a conversation between two groups of people. First, this is the man on the left is a moderator. I don't know his name. The two gentlemen on the right work for Northrop Grumman. The date is March 2014. The location is the Dole Institute of Politics. That's KU's Research Center for Political Science and Public Policy. It is called the Dole Institute because it houses former Senator Robert Dole's papers and library, but it is a nonpartisan political science institute. And what's happening here as we enter into it is a panel conversation on drone design, drone capability, and the way it's, the vision for its use in the coming decade. And the two men on the right are Admiral Timothy Beard and Scott Winship, Navy retired, both now at Northrop Grumman. And Winship's going to make a quip in this video at some point about Top Gun. And the thing to remember is that Top Gun is, the star of that, aside from Tom Cruise, is the Grumman F-14 Tomcat. So that's a marketing joke. The other thing to notice is about where Winship's hand is, and Winship's the guy on the right, you're going to see a face in the foreground here. Watch that guy's face when there's a mention of something from fiction, because he kind of smirks at it. And I think in 2014, it was something we could smirk at, and now it's not really a smirk-worthy moment anymore. And so it's sort of interesting to see how the reactions to what you're about to see have aged. With that preface, here we go.
Yes, clearly the problem of proximity in relationship to violence and warfare is a minor point. From human history, the rock to the stick to the gun to the hellfire is increasing a distance from the target of violence. The real issue here is that we might be right on the verge of something like a Skynet. When you combine what just came out about the NSA on the intercept of the NSA's role in the secret U.S. assassination program, and combine that with the technology that you all are involved in creating, you have the possibility of taking all human elements out of it. And so my question is, even with the human elements involved, we've already seen U.S. citizens, a minor, Abdul Rahman Alaki, murdered. It's clear in the Constitution that treason must be defined as waging war on the United States of America. So even if you wage war, even if this man and his son were accused of waging war, they must have a trial and not be assassinated from afar. So with your knowledge and participation in this, you have an ethical stand that you need to make, because you know that you're giving your technology to an organization, the U.S. government, that has murdered a U.S. citizen. So
what's your question, sir?
What are we going to do in terms of this precipice that we stand on, in terms of the evisceration of our rule of law?
Elect different leaders.
Good answer.
Elect different leaders. I mean, it is that the ability to kill someone anywhere in the world exists, whether it's remote piloted vehicles, whether it's B-2 bombers, whether it's a 45 automatic. The decision to employ those, I think, is what you're questioning, and whether that's morally or legally ethical. And I'll tell you, I wouldn't disagree. That is a question that has to be asked. Whether it was, but whether we did it with an F-16, and I just use that as a manned vehicle, or did it with a drone, I still see the same moral, ethical issue.
Okay, we have a question on the side over here.
Okay, I'm going to stop us right there. So first of all, I'm not making a comment on the ethics of drones. Okay, I'm making a comment on the ways the question and then the response engage in thinking about design and in thinking about where the ethical onus of design lies, and then in thinking about fiction's role in the larger picture of the design work that's being done by Northrop Grumman at this time. The student was not well received. I assume that's maybe an advanced undergrad or an early grad student. Clearly somebody very informed, clearly somebody not terribly well polished, but it was, if you take apart his comments, here's really what he's saying. It's actually a lot sharper than it may have come off in that moment. But he's basically arguing, look, drones increase the user's bodily withdrawal from the battlefield, right? That's a really interesting point he's making about a design feature of drones and the way as a war material. He's pointing out that drones increase the destructiveness of an attack, and that's a commentary he's making on the history of warfare, right? It's not rocks anymore. He's pointing out that recent use of drones is questionably lawful, which at the time was true. He's pointing out that the AI used to control a drone is potentially capable of deciding whether and when to kill a target. And that's actually ratified by an interesting voice who I didn't have time to insert in the presentation today, but his name is Daniel Suarez. And what's interesting about Suarez is he's done a TED Talk basically arguing against giving drones AI that's capable of making what's called a kill decision. And as part of making that argument sort of to a broader American culture, Suarez has also written kind of a Tom Clancy potboiler sort of book about, you know, a terrorist incident in which drones had the kill decision. And this is sort of his way of saying, look, this is why we don't want to do this. But the interesting thing about it is, unless you've seen his TED Talk, you could read that book and be like, yikes, that's a scary version of the future. Let's make that before somebody else does, right? Which seems in some ways to be the way Winship was thinking in this conversation. And so, fiction is not straightforward. Suarez would have used it one way. I think defense developers might view it a different way. The other thing is, this student is saying something like, what seemed to us a dystopian science fiction, and there he references Skynet, which, if you're not familiar, is a sort of allusion to the Terminator franchise. What seemed like it might just be science fiction a few years ago may be on the verge of becoming a reality. And I think this is where he lost some people in the audience. And in 2014, that was maybe not as intuitive a conclusion to reach. 6 years later, I think people are much more aware of the connection there, and probably a bit more open to thinking about the ways the humanities and sort of design, and even design in the defense sector, have a conversation. And then the conclusion he reaches is that therefore the designer has some responsibility for considering whether, in this case, he wants to contribute to these outcomes. And that might not have been a comfortable moment for anyone in the room. I certainly kind of stiffened a little bit watching these two sides of the conversation, but I wasn't totally satisfied with Winship's response either, right? Elect different leaders, to me, coming from somebody who's deeply involved in the design process and superintending a team tasked with that, I didn't feel like that was a satisfying ethical engagement with the issue. I felt like it was kicking the can sort of across the road to the White House and the Capitol building. And so I guess if I thinking myself as a designer, what if it had been one of my students that said, your website's so terrible, it's costing me thousands of tuition dollars and I'm not learning anything, I might have a bit different reaction to that, rather than, blame the administration for making us use a website or something like that. What I want to do is take us back to that moment, because what happens next is where the question we started with today was born. And I'm so grateful we caught it on film and it lives on YouTube. And if you want to DM me after this presentation, I can send you the whole video from this night. But this is, and I'm sorry I'm young and kind of floppy looking in this, but this is where that question was born then. And all I did was nuance what that other student was saying and look at the change in reception here.
Okay, we have a question on the side over here.
Thank you for taking my question. On the heels of the Skynet reference, I have a more autobiographical question for each of you. Is there fiction or film that has kind of influenced the vision of the work that you do, or the development of the technology that you do? So really asking questions about the ways we imagined this maybe 30 years ago, and how that's affected the way it's come to fruition.
It's a very interesting question.
Can I say Top Gun?
Sure.
Your question was, is there a film that, or a Hollywood depiction of that influences what we do, or what we think?
Film or fiction.
Film or fiction.
Not necessarily film, could be
Literature?
Okay. I'll start with and try to answer your question, because I think I love science fiction. Like I'd read a fiction, then a nonfiction, fiction, nonfiction, and I think what you really need to know, or you need to, it sounds a little bit pedantic, I guess, but what you really need to understand is the whole Skynet thing. We are so far from that. Having done the programming of some of these computers, oh my God, we are very, very, we are MS-DOS. C:// compared to your Apple iPad, and maybe even further than that. Maybe it's just rocks. I will say that some of the fiction you see and some of the some of the literature you see about the future state, it's compelling without bending to its influencing. It certainly is compelling, and some of the things that come up is compelling. And I'll bet you that the Terminator reference and the Terminator movies have influenced a lot of people to kind of have second thoughts about this technology, just because that kind of future is kind of nasty. So, good question though. I don't really have a good literature I can think of. 1984 maybe, a little Orwell.
Okay, so
Okay. Have another question back here.
there we go. If you read Orwell, that's not a reassuring answer from somebody working for our government. You know, it's bringing about surveillance culture, you know, and totalitarian government power, that sort of thing. It's interesting when we think about the way Winship answered that question, and I want to point out a couple things. First, I never said science fiction. I said on the heels of the Skynet reference, so I was just alluding to the previous questioner, and he connected the dots and said science fiction, which I thought was really interesting, because, you know, normally when we think about fiction influencing design, for some reason science fiction is the one that comes up most often, but I don't think science fiction has the corner on the market of being kind of a design blueprint. I think we can pull designs for things out of fictions that were never intended to forecast the future, or, you know, try to, as H.G. Wells called it, anticipate what's coming. Another thing is, I didn't assume that fiction was an influence. I said, is there fiction or film that's influenced the work you do? And either one of them could have said no, and I think Timothy Beard sort of did, whereas Winship was like, well, sure, let me answer that question. And I didn't ask him for a title. I just asked whether it had influenced them, and he gave me 2 titles. So it's interesting because I was trying not to slant the answer, and what I got was not only that fiction has definitely influenced some of Winship's work, it's that science fiction has, and he could give us 2 titles. And so I think that's really, you know, an interesting awareness on his part, because he was able to point us back to some things that had come to mind over the years as he was working. If you think about Top Gun, which is a fairly nationalist American film, and really there's this way, right, that it's designed to be kind of a protracted infomercial for the American Air Force at the time, and the F-14 as a plane specifically. And if you read up on this, the Pentagon actually has an office dedicated to this kind of thing. It liaises with Hollywood, and you have to go through this office if you want, you know, people in uniform, any of their vehicles in your film. There's a whole department of the Pentagon dedicated to that, and that's the way to get it if you're a producer. So that makes a certain kind of sense. You take the nationalism and the sort of machine culture of Top Gun and merge it with the surveillance culture of Orwell, you know, which you'll recall if you've read it, is set on, quote, Airstrip 1. And it's really not hard to see how a future a future military kind of where war is waged, remote control, you know, remotely through vehicles is, you know, it sort of naturally follows from those 2 texts. So I understand why he would cite those. Again, what I'm really not comfortable with here is the fact that, you know, the answer when we start thinking about that fiction ethically is just to elect different leaders, right? The real problem here is the user, not the designer, essentially. And I'm not sure that I agree with that approach. And that's what I ended up spending years of dissertation writing trying to take apart. In what ways has fiction influenced this machine culture that we've created? And maybe not just the weaponized machines, but even our consumer grade machines, which we're becoming aware of are not necessarily great for our environment. And so as I sort of worked through that, I want to offer you a third thesis from my work, which is that engaging fiction from within an ethically informed paradigm, you know, our ethics prevent that fiction from unduly influencing our work, or prevent us from engaging in design influenced by fiction without, you know, reflecting on the ways that fiction might be shaping our view of well, of course the future looks like this, or of course this is the way it has to be because this is the next step in a technological development curve or something like that. And so, here Willis again becomes helpful because she's basically pointing out that as our existence becomes increasingly designed, and if philosophy's sort of inquiry into existence, then design should be a major focus of philosophy. And so I think that hourglass, that magnifying glass of our sort of criticality, may be enriched by a low-level interaction with philosophy and going, okay, what does philosophy have to offer us as designers? And so I thought, to kind of segue us into ethical, ethical thinking as we think about fiction, and then, which starts a conversation with design ethics, it might just help to have a brief overview of philosophy as it's kind of historically played out. As a field of inquiry, it tends to get divided into 3 subfields. And depends who you ask. There are people who would argue with me on this, but I think for busy professionals trying to just make it useful to them, this is a good way to look at it. Epistemology, don't be scared by these weird looking words, by the way. Epistemology is just the theory of knowledge. And it really raises questions like, how do we know what we know? And how can we be sure that we know it, right? And so we engage in epistemology as designers, maybe with respect to the projects we're on, but we don't do it in a more philosophical way about, our projects themselves. Like, how do we know we should be doing this? Someone else has already done that work for us. And so as designers, like Tom works on infographics, those are a kind of epistemology, right? They're a way of knowing things about the world, and in some cases a way of being sure we know what we think we know about the world. Metaphysics is a subfield of philosophy that really asks questions about what's true and real, or like what is the essential nature of the things we encounter in the world. For example, I'm essentially caffeinated right now. And then ethics is really where I want to take us today, and it's much more concerned with what's morally right, what ought we to do, what are virtues, and what acts and are virtuous, and then for whom would those be virtuous and under what circumstances. One of the sort of paradigm cases is it virtuous to lie to the Nazis if they come to your house and you're hiding people they want to kill? So we don't need to get into something maybe quite so theoretical at the moment, but when we do get into ethics, it sort of breaks down into 3 subfields as well, right? And so deontology, which comes from the Greek root for duty, right? Deon is duty. It's the study of what our duty is. And my experience working with creative thinkers is that they're not real jazzed about duty. We don't love being made to do things or obligated to do things. We'd much rather engage our inner drive to create. And yet I think it behooves us to consider deontology, especially at the moment, because we live in times where we realize that we may have a duty to more people than the user or the contract holder, right? We're sort of freshly aware in the US of the ways that our society has been designed for some people and not for others, and we might have a duty to redesign it because we have a duty to all of humankind at some level. And here I think, a good example of thinking about duty and, deontological engagement in ethics comes from Cameron Tonkinweiss's contribution to the design philosophy papers, which came out in volumes. And so this was the 05 volume. Tonkinweiss makes a couple points here that I think are worth noting. First, design makes the world comfortable. And Tonkinweiss would argue that comfort is moral, right? So there's this way, he's really getting at what designers call pain points, right? He's nuancing design in terms of pain, but he's basically saying that as we work to make the world less painful for people, we're doing moral work, and we are creating a world that is more morally acceptable to us. And the implicit, the implication underneath talking about designing for a pain-free world as a moral thing is that we have a duty to do this, right? And especially given the ways that the world is especially painful for some Americans over others. The American world is painful for some Americans over others. We may realize more and more in the coming months how great a duty we have to redesign the world for the people that it's painful for. Eudaimonia is a really scary looking word, but it's actually a really cool word. It's probably my favorite in ethics. The EU prefix in any Greek rooted word always means good. And that daimon is, if it looks like demon, it literally translates right spiritedness. And this is where we get the concept of virtue. And so eudaimonic ethics, or ethics concerned with eudaimonia, are really asking questions like, what's the good life? What's virtuous? And are there ways of thinking or living or acting that are intrinsically good? And if so, what would those be? I think we start to get into eudaimonia when we think about sustainable design. I think there's a way we say, a design that endures and doesn't need to be reworked right away. That's eudaimonic, that's virtuous, that's the good life. And here, Bodil Johansson and company give us a couple of good examples of eudaimonic ethics at work in design. First, they suggest that we should design for humans and not for previously designed machines and objects. So by suggesting that, I think what they're really saying is we don't want to go on designing for the things that have already been designed, because eventually what we do is we kind of design the human right out of the world, or we make the world, in Tonkin Weiss's terms, painful for humans. And then the other thing they point to here, of course, is what we all probably know as universal design. So designing the world even for the people who aren't abled in the same way that the rest of us are. And again, that comes back to a sort of Tonkin Weiss spin on design and pain points. There are people for whom the world is painful, and we may need to make it more universally available so that it's not painful for them. And there's, that's a vision of the good life is seen ethically. And then the last one is teleology. And I think teleology for designers is so straightforward. It's like, that is what designers do. And the Greek root there is telos, which is, kind of translates as an inbuilt purpose. Or we would call it a design, right? We've built a purpose into this object. But teleological ethics asks questions like, what's worth doing? And what ends are worth pursuing, and do the ends justify the means? And what means do they justify? And I think this is where in the drone forum at the Dole Institute a few years back, we saw, a student and some designers kind of get into it, because I think when you work for a defense contractor, you've already sort of come to terms with the fact that war is part of the way the world is. And once you've made your peace with that, I think it's a much easier sell to engage in even, software writing or something that's not necessarily combat, but has combat applications. Whereas, as a student in your maybe 20s or early 30s, you might not have made peace with the fact that there's violence in the world. And so it becomes easier to question, whatever goes into the technological development that's contributing to war in the world. And I understand there's also probably identity at play in that video. And, there's a lot, it's a very complicated issue, but teleology was really, I think, the conversation in which those two voices were meeting. And I think as we bring these categories to design, they enrich our ethical thinking about design, but insofar as fiction is designed, they also enrich our thinking about fiction, so that we don't look at 1984 and go, we better build the capability of ruling society that way, whether we use it or not, before somebody else does, right? We might say differently that, oh, we have a duty to make sure this doesn't happen. Or because that's not the good life, right? An Orwellian world is not the good life for anybody except the people at the top. And it's not an end that justifies the means that we would have to put into it anyway. So hopefully that makes a little more apparent how ethics could work for us as designers. And I'm going to put those three ethical sort of subcategories back up on the screen here, but what I thought we might do at this point is break out. Tom, Lars, we have what, about 20, 25 minutes left?
Yeah, if we need to. Yep.
Okay. We have as much time as you all want, you know, within that time limit. But if we haven't heard from you, I'd really be interested to hear kind of how ethics looks the way you use it in the design work you do. And if we haven't heard from you, it'd be nice to hear names, the kind of design work you're doing and where you're doing it, and then maybe how ethics starts to look in that place. So these are the categories in case, you know, they're useful to you, but wanted to leave you access to those. So, and thanks for being here today.
Hi, this is Lars here. I guess my first question to you, Aaron, would be, you know, I think the problem that we as designers have is we don't really know what's going to happen with our designs after we make them, or maybe we don't have the foresight to see what could go wrong. You know, maybe the fictional story that we've created, the storyline our user is going to walk through, it might not be, you know, robust enough to really understand the implications of the experience we're creating. So my question to you would be like, how do you think we should start to think about, you know, the teleological approach or deontological approach to making these stories for these users? Like, where do we even start with that?
That's a really interesting question. My knee-jerk reaction is to ask what it would be like to think like a supervillain about your design. You go, how could I misuse this? And then to return to the design as the designer yourself and to ask, how can I prevent that misuse or those misuses that I was able to come up with? That's an off-the-cuff response.
I think what's interesting to me, listening to you talk, is perhaps coming at this from another angle, which is the influence, not so much on the ethics side. Like, we have a duty, which is about, you know, practical, like, how do we improve things? How do we not do this? How do we not do that? How do we do this? But rather, like, looking at the influence, because I think in our world that we live in now, we're so heavily influenced, and I think influence is becoming more and more increased, certainly with technology. I'm thinking particularly about, like, I used to love watching, you know, war films, right? I can't watch them anymore, but that's another story. But I used to love watching them, you know, things like Black Hawk Down, Saving Private Ryan, you know, the list goes on. I mean, there's hundreds of them, right? And so some of them are true and some of them are fiction. But what's interesting there is the kind of narrative that fictional writers are putting out there, particularly in terms of, like, you know, American super dominance or supremacy, you know? And, like, this is a really interesting subject to me, because I feel like it's not just a film about war and about how do we defeat the bad guys, but it's actually contributing to this societal supremacy, which is really being challenged today in every sector of society, right? So I don't know if this is just a question. I don't know if this is a question, but more of just a statement, a sort of a, you know, how do we, I mean, I think about your statement, we have a duty to not make this happen, but we're being influenced on a much deeper level, you know. And I feel like in my practices, part of what's contributed to me not watching these films is actually opening myself up to a cosmological, you know, view of the universe, a of mankind, of humans, of human nature, right? I mean, we've lived with these narratives of dominance for decades. And they have shaped religion, they've shaped government, they've shaped society. And so when you look at things cosmologically, we are one human race. And you start to see the beauty in everything. And you start to feel the beauty in everything. And you start to feel like, oh my gosh, how could I ever design anything that will bring any harm to anyone? You know? So I wonder if there's a flip-flop sort of way of looking at it where we don't try to do things differently, but we look at what's influencing us and open ourselves up, you know, to a new kind of influence, which would influence our design.
So that's actually really close to what I'm advocating here. I think, you know, what I heard there is, you know, a global awareness, you know, a less painful world. I mean, we're back in eudaimonia, right? Like, we're reimagining the good life in a real way. And I think some of that, Tom, it even sounds like, you know, we kind of have a duty to create that, given how painful the past has been, you know? And so we might even have pushed all the way back from teleology through eudaimonia into deontology, right? To the extent we believe we have a duty for that. Yeah, and maybe this isn't you know, it's hard to draw a line between professional and personal. For me, my work is a lot of both, and I assume that may be true of many of your cases. But you know, there's a way in which our employers might not pay us for this, and yet cultivating this sort of habit of thinking about, you know, what is really worth spending my life on or my career on, you know, and who really needs frankly, the gift and the education and the experience you all have, you know. You know, we have to ask those kinds of questions as designers, and you know, those aren't necessarily things we get to ask on the clock, but I think they enrich our work when we're doing it. And so part of why I'm presenting these categories is to be able to say, you know, in my off hours when I was watching war films, what am I doing instead that may come back and sort of fertilize my work as a designer when I'm on the clock?
Right. Yeah, it's a good point.
I think that's where we get back to the nutritional view of fiction.
I put a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Is there a book or laws of UX ethics? That's a great question. I'll tell you, Lars and I have been on kind of, it's like, if there is, it's like the Holy Grail, right? Like, we've been looking for something like that for a while. I do think the design philosophy reader is probably the best I've found in a single book so far. But I'm not totally sure it's everything I could have hoped for and more. One book that's really, really technical. So if you like, you know, deeply philosophical thinking, you know, then maybe it's for you. Otherwise, maybe not. Is Moral Philosophy by a guy named Louis Pojman, and that's Pojman. And again, really technical book. But what's interesting about it is it's kind of like training for a marathon a little bit mentally. But a couple essays in, you start to get the hang of how these people talk, which is not the way the rest of us talk. But their concerns are real, and they have a very technically nuanced view of thinking, and, you know, parsing fine moral distinctions and understanding why these different things are different. And yeah, Pojman's just, I think, you know, in philosophy, probably the big one. I don't think it's well tailored to designers though. So if you don't have a background in that, it's probably not your jam. And I kind of think this is a thing somebody needs to come along and rewrite for professionals, especially busy people who don't have time to like figure out what these intellectuals are saying? It's a great question.
Any more questions for Aaron? Any more thoughts?
Could you talk more about, so like I've been deep learning in machine learning lately. I've found it to be quite fascinating. And I'm interested, like I put earlier in the chat a question about, you know, obviously no one's going out and seeking to ruin people or ruin experiences and things like that. So, you know, there's been a lot of examples, one of machine learning, where they, companies took in certain interviews or resumes or things like that, and, you know, they were written just so or said just so, and therefore the machine learning algorithms learned to seek out those people, and they happen to be, for example, like white males versus more culturally diverse. And I'm not trying to get into a whole conversation about that or anything, but you know, that wasn't the intent, right? The intent was to have a more logical way of qualifying candidates for, you know, to be representative of the needs of the business and perhaps even a cultural fit. Could you speak to some of those sorts of, you know, machine learning gone wrong, AI type things more?
Yeah, that's a great question. Machine learning is huge in this. And it's kind of a new hot item in the humanities in general and philosophy in particular. And of course in literature, a lot of it, you know, if you've never read Isaac Asimov's book, I, Robot, I know there was a Will Smith movie, it's not the same thing. But it really raises some interesting and much more fun to consume case studies in the ways machines think and behave. So if you're into sci-fi, that's a big one. Yeah, in terms of algorithms gone wrong, so it seems like maybe we asked the right question and we focused it on the wrong group of people there, right? How can we make the world less painful? And yet implicitly what we really meant was, how can we make it less painful for HR reps? And we didn't necessarily think about job candidates as well as we might have, right? Or we couldn't anticipate the ways that software that was designed to make a sea of applications less painful for HR reps might go actually kind of wrong for the people filing those applications. Am I getting it, sort of what you're asking there?
Yeah, but I also think part of the problem is the people who are programming them have a very particular set of bias, and so they're programming those bias into those systems.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like a good design might be to allow the HR department to rethink what criteria it's using to search things, you know, or something, you know, so that it's not hard coded into the code, for example. So that when they discover there's a bias to the way the search algorithm is working, they can say, oh, okay, the way it's commonly, we can maybe study applications from non-white males and see how other people are saying, besides white males, are saying things relevant to this job, and is there continuity there, and should we update our search terms so we find those people because they actually mean what we mean, just in different words. I'm not sure what that gets at what you're asking.
I mean, it was really an open-ended question because it is an open-ended scenario and problem.
It is. Well, and the other one that comes to mind with regard to race is facial recognition, of course, right? For initially when facial recognition rolled out, if you were dark skinned, it would, like, AI couldn't recognize your face. Which at the one level, you know, in terms of, you know, law enforcement, maybe that's a feature, but, you know, in terms of consumer goods, like, you know, my Pixel smartphone, which is supposed to have facial recognition, it makes that product inaccessible to you.
To just complicate this discussion a little bit, You know, design is, as designers, I think we're moving into, you know, these products, understanding that they're going to be iterative, you know, and the product's never really finished. And what's so difficult is you have something that, you know, has a fatal flaw, and by the time it's released, maybe it's just too late. And, you know, if we can get it 50% of the way there to work well for everyone, I think our problem as designers is maybe just not even knowing where to focus our efforts, where to, you know, how can we get it, if it's not going to be, you know, the real way we want it, how can we get it close enough? And, you know, these problems we see with technology, you know, they miss, you know, maybe they don't go through enough user testing, or, you know, enough rounds of prototyping or things like that. So my question would be like, you know, how do we know that where we're putting our efforts or where they're most valuably placed, especially with, you know, the business constraints on us as far as like timeline goes and budget and other things like that. I don't know, my question, maybe what would a method for tracking that look like, you know, or for placing our efforts look like?
Well, I think that's where our tech writers become really useful resources. You know, I was a user admin for 4 years over the software that kind of superintended dining for American University in Washington, D.C. And when you have, you know, 15,000 people that need access to food through accounts running through your database, you start to go, oh, like, there's kind of a Maslow hierarchy of needs thing that this system governs. And when I came into that role, I inherited zero documentation from my predecessor. And people were like, you know, he did some audits, we're not really sure where he looked. And so I spent my first year trying to just figure out what this thing did and how and why we would need to audit it and what we would need to know about it and all these other things. I think it came down to a bunch of tech writing. And I wonder if that's in some ways some of our difficulty is after all the coding, now we have to tech write what's still to be done, or you know what I mean? I mean, it's like it feels like the writing never ends. We're just switching languages, and even that is one way. Maybe some of our roles are a bit unwieldy. You know, there are pain points in our work, and it's now that I'm done writing code, I have to write tech, you know, like prose to explain what's happening or not happening here, something like that.
I totally agree. At the company I work at, Use Agility, we did like an inventory of, you know, where are we lacking the most, and I think a lot of that comes down to converting design requirements into development requirements. So that's definitely an ongoing process.
Yeah. You know, there's this way that like we probably don't think about, you know, even things like inserting comments into code as, you know, like, that does not strike me as an ethics issue on the face of it. And yet there might be a way, right, if you work in a revolving door environment, kind of that department that I was in was, you know, we had a very high turnover rate. And the more I think about it, the more I think, yeah, it probably would have been a bit more of an ethics issue than I thought of at the time, to make sure whoever came after me knew exactly what was happening at certain critical points within the software, things like that.
That gives great meaning to that kind of a role.
Well, yeah, staring at a screen feels in some ways like a small world, and maybe a bit meaningless some days, but yeah, when we think about the impact for, you know, tens of thousands or even millions of users.
How is that different than a drone in a way?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of you are working on healthcare software, and it's as life and death potentially, you know, in terms of the minutes it takes and the keystrokes it takes to get somebody signed into an ER, right? It may be as life and death as a drone at that level. And, you know, at our house, we're expecting our first any day now. And so, you know, one of the things that I'm kind of constantly wondering is, how does healthcare software help us get checked in as quickly as possible when my wife's in pain? you know, that's going to be an experience we're about to have. And it's where you hope for good developers and designers.
Absolutely.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. It's been interesting to hear kind of what you're thinking about in terms of your work. And I imagine in some of your work, it may feel like, you know, I'm just a guy sitting at a computer doing a very nuanced job, and the larger ethical dimensions of the project I'm on are somebody else's baby. But, you know, in some ways, this might be just a vote of confidence that maybe there's more, you have more impact than you realize. And then there's also, you know, the impact over time, right? I imagine, you know, my environment, as the way I practice instructional design, there's not a lot of room to go up as a designer anyway. It just sort of, you become an instructor and you might get tenure, but that doesn't mean your job description changes. For you all, there's a bit more of a career ladder to climb, and, you know, I think as you develop the habits at a sort of an admin level, there are ways that it gets, you know, the shadow that your good work casts gets longer and wider the kind of the higher up you get. And you know, that may be a way to take confidence in your work as well. But yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to just broach the subject with everyone today. And thanks to Lars and Tom for inviting me, and UXPA for having me.
Yeah. No, this is fantastic. I mean, I think there's a lot of, you know, webinars and talks out there that, you know, kind of get at the theory of things, you know, the practical of design. But this has been really kind of refreshing to sort of dig a little deeper under the surface of why, you know, and ask some deeper questions. So I really appreciate your perspective, Aaron, and your knowledge and your expertise. It's been really great listening to you, and thank you for such an excellent, detailed presentation. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. I know you all have some great questions. So
I was going to add, we have 2 other events coming up within the next month, so check those out. And then, of course, follow the UXBA KC, LinkedIn, Twitter for more updates and stuff like that.
Yeah. Awesome.
Happy Friday, everyone.
Yeah, happy Friday to you. Have a great weekend.
All right. You as well, Tom. Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Lars.